So when I wasn't religious, I did a lot of things that are not al pi halacha, but nevertheless, I feel like I learned a lot from them. So therefore, my question is, do I have to really regret doing all those things, or is it just that I have to commit never to do them again?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. A person was not religious for part of their lives, and they did things that are against the halacha, not because they intended to rebel against God, but they didn't even know there was anything wrong with what they did.
Would it be different if somebody intended to rebel against God?
Oh, I'll address both of it. Or someone, again, there are two different varieties, right? Either a person just didn't know, or a person knew and said, I don't care and I'm going to rebel against Hashem. Now they do tshuva. So tshuva at a minimum, of course, means that you're going to try not to do it again. But the question is, how do I relate to that past? Now, it is interesting that obviously one of the requirements of tshuva is not only Kabbalah la'asid, where you resolve not to do it in the future, but there absolutely is an element of charat al-avar, in which I regret, I have remorse, I'm sorry for what I did in the past. So from a very technical standpoint of the mitzvah of tshuva, you are mechuyev to have regret. And yet there is, it's actually a much more complicated dynamic than you might think. You regret it, you're sorry that you did it, you know that you shouldn't have done it, but you still recognize that I learned something from it that I would not have known otherwise. And in that sense, again, what do you say? Not that I'm happy I did it, but I'm happy that I learned the lesson that I needed to learn. It's a very subtle issue. And Rav Tzadok even talks about the fact that before the fact, you have to try your hardest not to sin. But after the fact, if you did sin, it may have been the Ratzon Hashem. Again, this is one of those Rav Tzadoks that are very explosive. After the fact, it may have been the Ratzon Hashem that you needed that experience to get you to a certain place. Now, as I say, this is one of those explosive Rav Tzadoks that actually were censored in some of the editions of the Tzidkas HaTzadik, because you understand the problem. A person could use it and prospectively, a person, no, I'm not going to try to fight my HARA because it's the will of God that I sin. No, I mean, you have to live your life that it's the will of Hashem that I don't sin. But after the fact, perhaps it was Hashem's will that you go through this experience. Now, the Gemara, Resh Lakish says in Maseches Yuma, a very remarkable statement. He says, when a person does tshuva out of fear of God, I'm afraid of punishment or whatever, so Hashem will treat his intentional sins as if they were accidental. They get knocked down. But if you do tshuva out of love of God, your aveiros become mitzvos. Not just they're erased and forgiven, they become mitzvos. If you have 1,000,000 aveiros, they become 1,000,000 mitzvahs. Now that's hard to understand. I understand that tshuva can give you forgiveness, which is still a wonderful thing. But forgiveness just means they get erased. They become mitzvahs. They say the Breitowitz, like a Breitowitz, went over to the town Russia and said, I'm so jealous of you. All you need is 1 minute of tshuva out of Ava, and you're going to be a bigger tzaddik than I'll ever be, because you have so many aveiros. So what's the pshat? How can a sin become a mitzvah? I understand a sin can be forgiven. That's tshuva. How can it become a mitzvah? So the answer is this. The answer is that a person looks back at their life and they use even the aveiros of their life as the foundation for how they serve Hashem. So Hashem counts the aveiros as your education towards serving. Let me give you a very concrete example, a simple example, and then you can extrapolate to other cases. Let's imagine a person, God forbid, was a drug addict. The person was on cocaine. Really, really, really bad. Drag of the earth. And now they do tshuva. They beat it. So there are two ways they can look at that past. They could say, I'm a new person. I'm amputating that part of my life. I have no shaychus to that life. Right? I'll just forget it. I want it to be erased. Well, that could be pretty good. But on the other hand, that does leave you with a zero for 20, 30, 40 years of your life. But let's assume a person decides he's going to become a drug counselor precisely because he understands what addiction is. And he has understandings that he wouldn't have had he not been an addict. That's a very different thing. He's not simply erasing his past. He is reclaiming his past and using it as the source of his goodness. So Hashem says, if that's what you're doing, I'm going to count your addiction as a mitzvah, because your addiction is the foundation of what you are. And this could be applied to a lot of things. You got to learn from your past. You got to learn from your past. It can teach you all sorts of things. Again, these are dangerous ideas. This is like playing with nuclear energy, so to speak, because God forbid we're not giving people a license to go out and do averos. We are obligated to live by the halacha. But after the fact, you got to look at everything in your life and say, what did I get from it? What does it teach me? How does it make me stronger? Now, I've mentioned this many, many times, and it's not perfectly analogous to what I'm talking about, but many of you remember or know of the late Rosh Yeshiva of Mir of Nosson Tzvi Finkel, Zichrono Livracha, a great man who was nifter a number of years ago. And he had multiple sclerosis for many years, and he didn't want to take medicine. That's why he was quivering and shaking, and it was hard for him to talk, but he just pushed himself not only to travel all over the world to raise money, but to give shiurim and learn. Mamish, an outstanding example of mesiras nefesh and dedication for Torah, and also loving every single Talmud of Mir, and really not just of Mir, every single Ben Torah in the world, basically, he just loved and cared about. So his story is well known. He grew up in a frum home. He's not a Baal Tshuva. He grew up in a frum home in Chicago, but it was his environment was more on the modern side. So he went to a co-ed high school. He was on the basketball team. He was on the debating team. He had girlfriends. All that stuff, modern Orthodox stuff. So, in fact, he even says when he came to Eretz Yisrael, his great uncle was the Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, so he wasn't a Chashuva family. So his great uncle set him up with chavrusas, and he had never learned Gemara for more. He had learned Gemara in high school, but he had never learned Gemara for more than an hour at a time. So a morning seder of 4 hours was totally exhausting for him. He couldn't believe it. So after 4 hours of learning, which was unbelievable for him, he asked his chavrusa, so what do you guys do in the afternoon here? There must be some recreation. He says, we learn. He says he couldn't believe it. So the thing was that one of his great kochos is that when American kids would come and visit Jerusalem, and they'd go to Mir, he would meet with them. And, they would see a Rosh Yeshiva with a beard and a long coat, and kind of, the less than beautiful accommodations of the yeshivish world, and they wouldn't know. They would figure he'd have no message for them. And he started talking about jump shots and basketball and debating teams and all the stuff they're going through, girlfriends, all the stuff that they're going through. And he said, yeah, I did that, and I know that, and And he was not trying to hide who he was. He wasn't trying to say, that's treif, that's no good. He was trying to show how even with that environment. See, I remember at his levaya, there were many Hispadim, of course. Many Rosh Yeshivas from all over the country came to eulogize with Nosson Tzvi Finkel. And the common denominator, hesped after hesped after hesped, was, you see what a person can become even though he comes from such a garbage environment. Meaning, secular studies and girls and basketball, And you see how he escaped it and transcended it and was able to become great and holy in spite of the tumah in which he was born. So I was listening to all those hespedim, one after the other. Every hesped said the same thing in different words. And, I had kind of a childhood like that. I went to an Orthodox day school, it was co-ed, etc. And I'm thinking, I don't look at it as tumah and evil and bad. And the truth is, the godless of Nosson Tzvi Finkel, yes, he did transcend his environment for sure, but he never left it. He never kind of made believe that wasn't part of him. He took the good from it, and he used it to connect to people in a way that he couldn't have done. He couldn't have done had he tried to just be from that pristine place in which none of these things were ever there. I hope, again, I'm rambling a little bit, but I hope you see the point here. The point is, you reclaim every part of your life, and you elevate it in your service of Hashem. And through that reframing, you're not only changing your future, you're redefining the meaning of your past. The past itself now has a different meaning. It is the precursor, it is the foundation of your avodas Hashem. And that is the yesod of Reish Lakish, that the sins are not just erased, they're actually converted into mitzvos. It's a very, very deep idea. Again, it's a complex idea, and it's a dangerous idea because once again, in the wrong hands, people can use it as an excuse to do all sorts of things. But I could talk about this a lot, and maybe I shouldn't talk about it as much as I like to talk about it. It's one of those things I like to talk about. You know, you have a Rosh Yeshiva who lives in Eretz Yisrael. He wants to raise his family Haredi al Tyrus HaKadosh. So there's no concept of, entertainment or TV or no, all of that is unthinkable. And yet, this Rosh Yeshiva may have grown up on Laurel and Hardy and Abbott and Costello and Green Acres or whatever an Irish guy. And when you give them a joke of Abbott and Costello, they'll start laughing. And they'll remember it fondly, privately, even though they would never allow their children to even think about that. Again, I'm just thinking out loud. In other words, the issue is, it was something positive for them. So the question is, you're going to have to ask yourself these questions. I mean, it was positive for them. Why isn't it positive for their kids? Is it a different time? No, maybe. Different challenges? Is society less moral than it was? Is it less TZNIUS than it was? The truth is, for sure it is. The TV of my childhood, they could not even show 2 beds in a bedroom together. I mean, there was a moral code about no profanity, no intimations. There was no concept of any type of sexual connection. Certainly no mention at all of gay, lesbian, or anything else. Today, that's all changed. So maybe so. Maybe the idea was that was what was reasonably, it was a waste of time no matter what was reasonably semi-kosher years ago might be totally treif today. But all I'm saying is there is a concept that I can tell you that there are chashuva people who are great in Torah who, draw upon some of that checkered past in terms of their understanding of people and everything else, right? So that's the idea of not amputating yourself, but kind of reclaiming it and using it in avodas Hashem. Yeah.
Ideally, we want Jews to marry Jews, and we want to curb assimilation and intermarriage as much as we can. But in a world where most Jews aren't doing shidduch dating, that can be harder to kind of control, I suppose. That being said, is there a problem with religious people setting up secular Jews together when we know they're not going to be shomer negiah? Are we putting an obstacle in their way, or does the purpose of making Jews marry Jews overrule that?
Yeah, that is a very, very excellent question. The intermarriage rate in the United States, in some places, is 70%. You know what that means? That means 7 out of 10 marriages in which one of them is Jewish, the other one is not Jewish. 70%, that's phenomenal. And indeed, the idea that the Jewish people are vanishing is very true, except for the frum. The Jewish people are getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And although people get very angry when you say this comparison, but many have compared it to a Holocaust, meaning the number of Jews that we have lost by intermarriage is greater than the number of Jews that we, God forbid, lost in the Holocaust. So in a sense, intermarriage is a Holocaust that we are perpetrating on ourselves. So as a result, getting Jews to marry Jews is like a number one priority. Now the question that you're raising is a very excellent question. most of these Jews are, at least initially, and maybe throughout their marriage, are not going to be religious, which means they will be having intercourse while their wives are nidos. There's a chiyuv kares on that, and you're being a matchmaker for a shidduch in which they're going to be over on kares. So you become a facilitator, you become a gorem of this sin. Is that not a prohibition of, Torah forbids it, lifnei iver lo sitein michshol, do not put a stumbling block in front of a blind person, meaning you are not supposed to cause other people to sin. Yeah, if they sin without you, that's their thing, but you're not allowed to be the one that causes them to sin. So the issue is participation in Jewish matchmaking with non-Shomer Shabbos people. Is that considered to be a lifnei iver lo sitein michshol? It is an excellent question, and the answer is not so pashut. But I believe that the psak halacha would be that getting Jews to marry Jews overrides everything. And the LAMDUS of this is actually based on a chiddush of Rebbe Kiva Eger, a very, very interesting chiddush of Rebbe Kiva Eger, and that is, you're allowed to cause a Jew to stumble in order to prevent a bigger stumbling. Let's take. Don't put a michshol in front of a blind man. Let's take that concrete example. Let's say a blind man is walking in the street, and he's going to fall into a 100-foot deep pit, which means he'll die for sure. So I push him into the street where he trips over some concrete block and hurts himself. So I caused him to trip over a concrete block. So I caused him to hurt himself. But I caused him to hurt himself to avoid him inflicting a greater harm on himself. So Rabbi Kiva Eger says it is not lifnei iver to be gorem a michshol katan if that is necessary to avoid a michshol gadol, which makes a lot of sense logically. So here we're talking about a situation where if we don't get involved in helping people find Jewish people, there's a 7 out of 10 possibility they're going to marry non-Jewish. And not only will that mean that they're not going to be religious, but either their kids are going to be goyim if the woman is not Jewish, or what's even worse, if the woman is Jewish, the kids are not going to be raised Jewish, even though they're Jews. So as a result, we would call intermarriage a much more serious michshol than even NIDDAH and Chilul Shabbos and everything else. So as a result, not only is it permitted, but it would be a mitzvah to have a michshol katan in order to avoid a michshol gadol. So the truth of the matter is, it is a big mitzvah to make shidduchim even for non-religious Jews, because that way you're minimizing intermarriage to the degree that you can prevent it. And when there's no intermarriage, there's always hope. There always is hope, because you never know what happens. You have a Jewish couple, you have a Jewish family, either you, the matchmaker, or the institution, or the community can help them be involved in Yiddishkeit, and they can become Baalei Tshuva, just as many people in this room might have become Baalei Tshuva. So you're actually doing something that may save them for generations, because you've made that Jewish shidduch. So that's a very, very big deal. Yeah?
Many say that the LUBAVITCHER Rebbe is MOSHIACH.
Yeah.
The question is it possible that the LUBAVITCHER Rebbe is MOSHIACH?
Yeah, this is one of those when did you stop beating your wife questions, meaning whatever whatever I answer, I'm going to get in trouble. First, I do want to say for sure, Lubavitcher Rebbe was a phenomenally great man, great in learning, great in righteousness, great in his Mesiras Nefesh for Klal Yisrael. There's no possible negative thing I could possibly say about the Rebbe, and again, his greatness is phenomenal. And I'll tell you, one of my guilty pleasures is I like to watch the Rebbe on YouTube. I like to see the dollar ceremonies and all the different things and the different advice he gives people, because there is so much wisdom. So everyone should understand that anything I say is not a criticism of an unbelievable leader. And you can see the greatness of his leadership, because after, about 30 years already, almost 30 years since his death, Lubavitch Chabad is a worldwide movement that keeps on going based on his inspiration, which means he's still leading them. I'm not talking about mystical stuff, but his teachings are leading this movement that, love him or hate him, and I love him. When you're in Hong Kong or Australia or Antarctica, I guess, I don't know if it's Antarctica, Chabad will get you kosher food, and at least a minyan on Shabbos. So very, very great. Now, the issue of whether he could be Mashiach is more or less a technical issue. When he was alive, there was no question he could have been Mashiach. And indeed, when the messianic speculation first began to surface in the 70s, the Rebbe's Mashiach, so somebody went to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was still alive, and said, "You have to issue a proclamation. They're saying the Rebbe's Mashiach." So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein said, "So what would be so bad if the Rebbe would be Mashiach? Why not?" And keep in mind the following point. If Mashiach can come every day, we believe that. That means there is somebody in the world today that would be Mashiach. There has to be. And 100 years ago there was somebody, and 200 years ago there was somebody, and 500 years ago there was somebody, because if there wouldn't be somebody, the Mashiach couldn't have come. So every generation, there is what you might call a potential Mashiach of that generation. Does that potential person know? Not necessarily. He may live and die, without ever knowing that he was the guy if the Jewish people were deserving. Right? So Mashiach doesn't know he's Mashiach yet until Hashem decides to reveal himself. So could the Rebbe have been the Mashiach? For sure. He certainly met the qualifications of righteousness descended from David HaMelech. Okay. All right, you could argue, you can go through the Rambam's list. You can say it mentions he'll fight the wars of God. Okay, but that could mean different things. That could mean fighting assimilation. It doesn't have to mean an army, so to speak. The question is, though, once somebody dies, and I'm assuming the Rebbe died. I'm not going with there are extreme views that the Rebbe didn't even die. Okay, I'm not going there. But assuming he died on the 3rd of Tammuz, so can Mashiach come back as Mashiach if he died? Now, Christianity believes yes. In fact, that was the problem with Christianity, because Yeshua was initially claimed to be a Messiah, but he didn't do anything. He didn't build a temple. He didn't bring back the Jews from the Galus. So Christianity invented the second coming to deal with that particular problem. Yeah, he didn't do it the first time. He'll come back the second time. Ramban, however, says in a famous debate that he had with a Jewish apostate that Judaism does not believe in a second coming. Once somebody is proclaimed to be Mashiach, he has to finish the job. He will die, Mashiach will die, but he has to finish the job. If he doesn't finish the job, that's a sign that he was not the designated Mashiach for that generation. So that's what the Ramban says. And I would also point out there's a certain logic to that, because if you're going to go with the idea that Mashiach can come back from the dead, then why should it be Lubavitcher Rebbe? Why can't it be David HaMelech? Why can't it be earlier people once they're going to come back from the dead? There's no reason why it has to be the last one. So as a result, I think most of the Torah world, even those who are very pro-Lubavitch, I'm not counting the anti-Lubavitch, even the pro-Chabad people believe that the Rebbe will not come back as the Melech HaMashiach because he died before he completed his mission. Perhaps he could have been Mashiach had the generation been worthy of him revealing himself. Now, Chabad claims, and again, this is a legitimate discussion, that there are some Makoros, some sources, that take issue with the Ramban and do believe that the Mashiach can come back from the dead. And that's not, now people say, well, isn't that Christianity? Well, yeah, it is, but it's a different guy. I mean, the fact that second coming is a Christian idea is not proof that it can't also be a Jewish idea. I mean, that's not really an argument, right? People always say, that can't be because that's Christianity. Well, okay, I mean, we don't believe that Yeshka's Mashiach for a different Rebbe, but the Rebbe could be. So Chabad does have some sources that say Mashiach can come back from the dead. The Abarbanel brings such a thing. There is a possible Gemara in Sanhedrin that might be understood that way, might be, because there are different ways of interpreting the Gemara. So I always tell people that if you believe Moshiach can come back from the dead, you cannot be called an apikoros. You cannot be called a kofar. There is a basis for that view, but it seems that most would regard you as mistaken. And as I've said many, many times, a mistake is not heresy. A mistake is not apikoros. It's a difference of opinion, and we don't know. When it happens, we'll know. When it happens, we will know. That's the joke they say. I shouldn't tell you this joke, but it's a Christian joke, but it can apply to this as well. That somebody calls up the Pope and says, I have good news and bad news. He says, the good news is Messiah has arrived. He says, so what's the bad news? He's coming from Salt Lake City, which is Mormon, but okay. so okay, that's a Christian joke, but you can make the joke Jewish. Good news, Mashiach has come. Bad news, it's from 770. We'll find out when it happens, and God will make it known in His good time. But all I would say is that right now, the majority of opinion seems to say Mashiach will not come back from the dead. Yeah.
If we find out after the fact that, let's say, a Rashi in a Gemara was a mistake and the scribe wrote down incorrectly, and find a caveat that has it a different way, and there's a halacha that was learned out from that Rashi through a Torah of Yosef, and ended up that halacha was followed for the past 1,000 years, do we have the permission to switch the halacha, or we have to follow the MAASER and the LAMDUS built on top of that Rashi?
Yeah. So the question would be, you're giving a specific example, but it can apply to a lot of scenarios, that let's assume a certain authoritative source, like Rashi, was the basis of halachic interpretation, and that was incorporated in Torah, Beis Yosef, Shulchan Aruch, Mishnah Berurah, whatever it is, and then we discover, assuming it's 100% proof, which, things are not that cut and dried, but assuming we discover that the predicate for all of these Piskei Halacha was based on a mistake. It was not what Rashi really wrote. It was a mistake in the Girsa. So the question becomes, does that undermine the whole foundation? Do we have the right to now say, that should never have been the halacha, and therefore we're free to argue with the Torah and the Beis Yosef and the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Berurah because it was predicated on a mistaken Girsa in Rashi, for example. So interesting question. So once again, it is a machlokus. There are those that take the position that since it's a davar pashut, that had those poskim been aware of this mistake, they wouldn't have come out the way they came out. Therefore, the halacha can be changed based on the fact that this was a mistake. But the Chazon Ish famously took the view that we have to fold this in to the hashgacha pratis of God's will. That if God did not let Rav Yosef Karo or the Torah be aware of these mistakes, it became part of the halachic Messiah, and at that point you have to assume it was the Ratzon Hashem. This was very, very nogay. In fact, it is nogay even today, although a little less so. In the 19th century, many, many, many new manuscripts of Rishonim were discovered. If you ever open up a Ritva, like the Ritvas that have notes on them, or the Rashba, and you read about it, you see the Me'iris were discovered in the 19th century. There were Rishonim that were lost. Okay, the Ramban was a little earlier, but Ramban was 18th century. But certainly a lot of the Iker Rishonim that we consider to be very fundamental were lost. Their manuscripts were lost for hundreds of years, and then we find them. And the question is, we sometimes see, they changed the Girsa here, and they changed the Nusach here, and they introduced different halachic conclusions than the Torah and the Beis Yosef and the Shulchan Aruch. And they didn't have access to these manuscripts. So what is the impact of the newly discovered Rishonim, right? Or even something like even a numerical count, where the Beis Yosef might say, Rov Rishonim say this, therefore. Well, it's Rov Rishonim based on the 6 Rishonim you had. But now we discovered another 20. So instead of it being 5 to 1, it now becomes 5 to 20. Right? In other words, your rove changes. So what impact does that have on halacha? So the Chazon Ish basically said he says most of the new stuff he doesn't even read, Of course, he didn't mean the new stuff from the 18th century, but the new stuff that came later. And he said it does not change the Messiah of Klal Yisrael, because the TZNIUS had what you might call a bit of a mystical understanding of what Hashem wanted us to know and what Hashem didn't want us to know. So, but others would argue, others would be a little more activist in saying halacha changes if the foundational reason for the halacha is going to change. Yeah?
How important is our logic and reasoning when trying to understand God and the Torah?
Yeah, how important is logic and reasoning when you try to understand God and the Torah? So it's an interesting question. You know, there's a famous statement that's attributed to Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, the great Rav Chaim of Brisk, where he said, our job is to understand the what of Torah and not necessarily the why of Torah. Meaning to say, we want to know, he said, what is the Torah telling me? Even in LAMDUS, in deep Gemara, you're trying to know what is being said here, not necessarily why. I mean, the ultimate why, in fact, that was a little bit of a difference, they say, between Rav Chaim, the Brisker Derech, and Rav Shimon Shkop, who was also a great, great Rosh Yeshiva, that Rav Chaim was trying to analyze and explain the what. What is being said? Why? You know, that's Hashem's will. That's Gezeres HaKosov. Everything is Gezeres HaKosov, but you just want to understand what is the Gezeres HaKosov. So Brisker Lumdus is not really concerned with a why. It's more concerned with a very precise analytical definition of your what's. Rav Shimon Shkop was a little different. He incorporated the Brisker Derech. In fact, he had been a Talmud of Rav Chaim for a short while. He was a Talmud of Volozhin at a time when the Nitziv and Rav Chaim were the two great Rosh Yeshivas of Volozhin. But Rav Shimon Shkop developed more of a, like, why? What is the svara for something? Okay, so I would say this. I would say, though, that generally speaking, logic and svara are very, very important components of Torah learning and even to try to understand Hashem. But you have to also have the humility to recognize that ultimately you're going to hit a wall at some point, meaning to say you don't condition your emunah and your fidelity and your commitment to halacha on how much of it you understand. So that's kind of the paradox in which we work hard to try to understand, knowing that we are going to fail in that ultimate endeavor. But that doesn't mean you don't try. It's like the idea that this is the limud of Torah. You try your hardest to get it, knowing that you'll have some success, of course, but no, you're not really going to get it. But you got to try anyway. So we do try to understand what's going on. Yeah.
Here's a send-in. Can someone with AIDS get married?
Yeah, can someone with AIDS get married? So let's analyze what the problem is. You know, AIDS, of course, is one of the ways AIDS is spread is by what's called unprotected sex. And obviously, therefore, if a person has AIDS and he would simply have regular relations with his wife, he would be putting her in sakana. So there are a few points here. So point number one is he absolutely cannot get married unless there is full disclosure to the other person. That's elementary. Okay, let's assume there's full disclosure, and let's assume that the woman consents to get married. So I'm assuming the fundamental question is, are they allowed to have sexual relations through a condom, which would be the only way they could have sexual relations in a way that would be relatively safe, although it's not totally safe even there. So the problem basically is this. The problem is that sexual relations through a condom generally is halachically treated as identical to masturbation because it is the emission of seed, of zera, of sperm, into the pouch of the condom and not into the woman's body, and that is an isur d'oraisa of hashchas asera, it's called, right? This is the maisa of Er and Onan, in which they spilt seed outside of Tamar's body in order not to get her pregnant. And what does the Torah say? They did evil in the eyes of God, and God took their lives, and this is hashchas asera. So the question becomes, is there a heter for an AIDS person with AIDS, to use a condom? Now, you might want to say, well, sure, it's mutter, because if they don't use a condom, it's pikuach nefesh. Right? That might be your instinctual answer. But if you think about that, that's actually not an answer. Because who says they have to have intercourse? Meaning like this. If the only reason there is a danger of spreading is because you're having intercourse, and then you're going to say, oh, and I could spill seed because it's pikuach nefesh, the answer might be not to have intercourse, right? So there are those that actually say, therefore, that there's no way an AIDS patient could have protected sex with his partner, unless she also has AIDS already, because that would be hashchas asera. However, Rav Moshe does have a tshuva, where Rav Moshe permits the use of a condom, not on the basis of pikuach nefesh, but on a more subtle basis. And that is, anything that is called derech tashmish, anything that is called normal sexual relations, is not hashchas asera, even if it won't lead to a pregnancy. Rabbeinu Tam points out, a person can have sexual relationships with a barren woman, a woman who has a hysterectomy, a postmenopausal woman, because as long as it's the tashmish of ish v'isha, that's not called hashchas asera. So says Rav Moshe, if you're a man with AIDS, condom becomes your derech of tashmish hamita. So for a stam guy to use a condom would 100% be usher for birth control or whatever it would be. But for an AIDS patient, this is derech tashmisha, derech of tashmish, so it would be mutter. Now, this raises a very, very interesting question. So if a man has AIDS, there may be a heter for him to be mashamish with his wife through a condom, because that is the way he does intercourse. What if you had a reverse situation, though? What if you had a situation where the woman had AIDS? I'm not sure exactly how it spreads, but I'm assuming unprotected sex could, I don't know, could either way. So the question is a man who's healthy allowed to use a condom to be meshamesh with his wife who has AIDS? That's not so pashut. Because based on Rav Moshe's LAMDUS, you can't look at the man and say this is his normal way of having intercourse, because he could have intercourse in a normal way with another woman. So that would be a tough situation. It's not clear at all we would matter a condom if it's the wife that has the problem. But Rav Moshe does give us a heter for the man to have a condom if it is the man that has the problem. So again, it would be a machlokes, but Rav Moshe would matter the man to be mashamish with a condom. Okay, yeah.
Here's a sentence. I've heard you say on numerous occasions that if you give MAASER, you won't necessarily become rich. You said that it may just be a factor that can be overridden by others. My question is, if that is correct, then how can Hashem say, Uv na bezos, if we may not actually see the wealth?
Yeah, that is a very, very excellent question, and the question's been asked in different forms many, many times. And that is, the Torah seems to promise that you will get wealthy by giving MAASER, aser ta'aser, give MAASER in order that you'll become rich. And people ask the question, well, I give MAASER and, I give 10% of my income to tzedakah and I'm not rich. So what's going on? So I tried to give, it's not me, I mean from different sources, I tried to give a number of answers why you don't necessarily get rich. It's not a guaranteed thing. One answer might be that it only applies to the MAASER of grain and not the MAASER of money. That would answer your question too, but okay, that's one answer. Another answer I gave, again, these are not my chidushim, another answer I gave was that when we say something will make you wealthy, that means it is a factor that causes wealth, but it can be canceled out by other factors that cause poverty. There are certain sins that cause poverty. So the two factors fight against each other, so you wind up being better than you would have been otherwise, but not necessarily that wealthy. In fact, even if you get poor, the MAASER protected you from getting poorer than you would have been. And as a result, you can never say there's some absolute standard. And then I gave a third answer, that what does it mean to be rich? What is the promise? It doesn't mean you're going to be Bill Gates. And it could very well be that a middle-class lifestyle today would be fabulously wealthy 500 years ago. So you are rich, right? You don't think you're rich, but you're a lot richer than you think. So the question, though, and I think these are good answers. These are logical answers. But the question is, and it's a good question, that it doesn't fit the pasuk in Malachi. Malachi was the last prophet. And the last chapter of the Nevi'im, which is the Haftarah of Shabbos HaGadol, happens to be my bar mitzvah Haftarah, is that Hashem says, B'chanuni, it's not in the Torah, it's in the Malachi, B'chanuni na bazos, test me, put me to the test, and you will see I will open up the windows of the heaven, and I will give you brachos ad b'lidai without any limit. So here it seems to say that it is posited as an absolute test. And if what I'm saying is, no matter what happens, there's no, I mean, in other words, I turned it, again, not me, but the different answers I was given, turned this into an untestable proposition. Meaning, yeah, even if you get poor, maybe it's because you have other averos or whatever it is. In other words, you can't test it one way or the other because, well, if you're rich, I guess that shows you're rich because of it, but if you're not rich, right? In other words, there's no way Hashem flunks. Something can't be a test unless there's a way of flunking it. In fact, that's a fundamental principle of science. Any proposition that is not falsifiable cannot be regarded as a true proposition because it lacks evidence. Because no matter what happens, it'll be okay. So that is a very, very good question, because with all of these terutzim, how can you say b'chanuni na bezos? Now, the truth of the matter is, though, that contextually, the pasuk in Malachi may not be connected to the individual giving of tzedakah at all. It may be referring to the Jewish people as a whole, doing the mitzvos of Maaser. And that particular pasuk, at least, is not a promise to the individual. It is a promise to the nation of Israel. Now, again, that's not denying that there are other sources that talk about God giving you wealth, but I think on those other sources, you can give the answers that I gave. That particular pasuk may not be connected to this issue at all. It's very clear, for example, that pasuk is talking about the MAASER of grain. And it's less clear, but I think very defensible, that is referring to Klal Yisrael keeping it and not the individual person. But it is a very good question, and this is just a possibility. Yeah.
I got married a few months ago, and
I know, yeah.
I never got a proper understanding of how what my relationship with my in-laws is supposed to be. So just a few questions that have come to my mind. Like, one is, am I supposed to kind of develop the same sort of vulnerability that I had with my biological parents, and like with that would come, I guess, it would mean that there would be, I wouldn't say less respect, but it's just like a different kind of relationship. If I try to replicate what I have with my parents, and the other one is, let's say my father-in-law walks into the room, do I stand up? And another one is, if I'm at their Shabbos table, and I'm benching, should I say the HaRachman that I would say at a parent's table?
Yeah, so the question becomes generally, how do we relate to our in-laws? And of course, numerous jokes, both Jewish and non-Jewish, about the different tensions that exist with, that's what they say, the Yiddish for a father-in-law is a shver. Now, shver also means a difficult, I was thinking, I don't know if there's a common etymology here, but, shver, why you call a father-in-law shver, and the like. So the truth is, you are mechuyev to honor your in-laws. It is of a lesser degree than your parents, so they're not your parents. In terms of how close you want to be with them, you have to honor them, you have to be respectful to them. How close you're going to be to them, it really depends on, it just depends. I can't tell you that halacha endorses one model over another model. There are many different models. There are marriages in which a person is so close to their in-laws that they really are like extra parents, sometimes maybe even a better relationship than the parents. In fact, I know cases where a couple's got divorced, unfortunately, and what happened was the in-laws still kept the relationship with the divorced spouse because they felt, they felt very, very close to them, and the like. Other people have a more distant relationship, and that's okay too. I mean, do you call them mom and dad? Do you call them Abba and Ima? How do you call them? So a lot of things in marriage generally are play it by ear. I know people want a definite answer. I can't always give a definite answer. The only thing I can tell you is you do have to be respectful. You, generally speaking, do not have to stand up when they come into a room, but in the harachamans, again, you wouldn't say avi mori. I don't think you would say avi mori, but show kavod, show respect. And now the Rambam does have a very interesting halacha, though, and I hope this should never apply to any of you. It's a theoretical halacha. The Rambam says that if my in-laws coming to my house, every time my in-laws come to my house, there's a lot of tension. They drive me crazy. It's a difficult situation. I have the right to request my wife that her parents shouldn't come to my house. And she has the right to request that my parents shouldn't come. But I cannot stop my wife from visiting her parents and talking to her parents, and she cannot stop me from talking to my parents. But within the home, each one has the right to exclude the other. Now, this is a last resort, this is an extreme resort, and one should absolutely try very, 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 very hard not to create this situation. But in extreme circumstances, halacha actually allows excluding in-laws from a home because of the lack of shalom bias that it might cause. Yeah.
It seems like the yeshiva system was set up in a way where learning Gemara is learned more towards LAMDUS and not towards down to HALACHA.
Yeah.
The question, I guess, is how did that come about and why?
Yeah, so the question is that the derech of learning in the yeshiva system seems to emphasize what you call LAMDUS. LAMDUS is theoretical understandings of concepts, but not necessarily tracing them to a final halacha, like what is the halacha, lamaisa, and the like. And the question is, why did that develop, and why is there such a lack of attention, so to speak, to halacha lamaisa? So first of all, it's important to say to define a term here. When you say the yeshiva system, when you say the yeshiva system, you actually mean the Litvische yeshiva system. Lithuania had what we call the great yeshivos that are the foundation of the non-Hasidic world. This would include Volozhin, which is the mother of yeshivos, Slobodka, Mir in Europe, Panovich, Kamenetz, Baranovich. This is kind of the honor list of the great Grodno, great institutions. But Lithuania was a little country, even though it had plenty. Well, that includes Belarus, Lithuania. That's where these yeshivas were located. That's not the whole Jewish world. There were many yeshivas in Poland, Hasidic yeshivas. There were yeshivas in Hungary. The Chassam Sofer's yeshiva was a huge yeshiva. And they had a different derech of learning. It didn't survive as much, although there are pockets. The Hungarian yeshivas, for example, had a much bigger emphasis in halacha lamaisa. Even if you were an unmarried bachar, you would be learning Yoredeya, the halachas that we learned for smicha. You'd be learning it just as part of your Gemara learning and the like. So that's just a matter of terminology, that when we say the yeshiva world, we're really thinking about the Litvische yeshiva world, which again became the dominant yeshiva society after the Holocaust, after World War II. Those are the yeshivas. Now, why they developed that particular theoretical orientation is a very, very interesting question. I once heard, I didn't hear it directly, but I once heard in the name of Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky that this was a response to the Haskalah movement of the 18th and 19th century. The Haskalah is referred to as the Jewish Enlightenment, although we do not regard it as very enlightening. And this involved Jews in many countries at different times, Germany, Hungary, Poland, Russia, in which, as they were given opportunities to go to universities and get secular education that had been denied to them, so many Jews felt they didn't want to live in the Middle Ages anymore, the dark, Torah learning where you're not involved in philosophy and the like. And many people, now there were religious maskilim, we would call them modern Orthodox, so to speak, who believed in secular wisdom plus Torah learning. So there were many maskilim who were Shomer Shabbos, although they were still viewed with suspicion. But many maskilim were porkei ol. Many maskilim, literally threw out everything. They were into Tanakh and grammar and literature, but they didn't want anything to do with halacha, nothing to do with Gemara, and the like. So Haskalah was kind of creating a certain view of the world in which Judaism was not intellectual enough. It was not broad enough. It was not as deep as science and philosophy and psychology and mathematics. It was superficial memorization of old-fashioned rules. I mean, that was the attitude of Maskilim. So Rav Yaakov suggested that the yeshiva world was developing in a way to kind of communicate the idea that all of the depth you think you'll find in secular wisdom, you have even more so in Torah. So it developed a theoretical discourse, sometimes a philosophical discussion. In other words, it was a way, because remember that the yeshiva world was losing the brightest minds to Haskalah. Haskalah was not for mediocre intelligences. That was reform movement or whatever it would be. Haskalah was for bright, creative, autodidacts. You know what autodidact means? People who taught themselves German and Russian to be able to read literature. I mean, these were brilliant people. I mean, their childhoods, they had learned Gemara, and then when they're 13 or 14, they want to break out, and they taught themselves Russian and taught themselves German. Brilliant, brilliant people. And the yeshiva world was losing, or the Torah world, not just yeshiva, was losing these brilliant people. So the yeshiva shederech was min hashamayim, a way of keeping these brilliant minds in the world of Torah. So if you're simply going to teach them halachos, practical halachos, that's not going to keep them. You need something theoretical, pilpul, and the like. Now, what's interesting is, and again, this is another topic I can talk a lot about, and I don't want to spend the whole time talking about it, is that this may not necessarily be the same challenge as we have today, meaning to say, the challenge of the 19th century was the intellectualism of secular culture and the need to create a Torah intellectualism. I mean, I hate to compare Torah that way. That was as good as, I mean, that'd be much better, as good as what's out there. Today, the issue may not be the intellectualism of secular culture. In fact, it's largely understood that secular culture is fairly bankrupt intellectually. Today, the issue is taivas, yetzer hara, drugs, sex, alcohol, hedonism. So some have argued that we're fighting, with the emphasis on LAMDUS, we're fighting the 19th century battle against Haskalah instead of the struggle against taivas that may need more musar, more yiras shamayim, more emphasis on practical halacha. So this is a big debate. I mean, again, I know it's frustrating when I don't give final answers, but there is a big debate about whether we should create yeshivas that are less connected to the high LAMDUS thing and more practical, or we still need those theoretical structures. The other point is, you have to keep in mind that yeshivas have become what you might call much more egalitarian institutions, meaning to say, in Europe, the great yeshivas, the average kid did not go to a yeshiva. He went to cheder until he was 15 years old, and then he went to work. 15-year-old, you were working as a tailor, a shoemaker, whatever it was. The people who went to yeshivos were the geniuses, were the brilliant. I mean, almost every student in the yeshiva was above average. That was no joke with Lake Wobegon. Like, everyone in our city is above average, right? So, well, in yeshivas, it was kind of true. Like, everybody was above average. So LAMDUS is a very, very good thing for very, very bright minds. But, Baruch Hashem, for various reasons, yeshivas have now become open to everybody. I mean, if you're an Orthodox person, you send your kids to yeshiva. I mean, that's what an Orthodox person generally does. So yeshivas are now kind of open admissions. They're no longer, Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge. They're now like open. So once again, the question is, are we teaching a curriculum that was geared for Elohim to a student body, many of whom are not Elohim? And would that require a curricular readjustment? You hear the issue. Now, Baruch Hashem, the yeshivas are wonderful, wonderful, but the question is it the best type of program for the average guy? And we could debate it. We could discuss it in various ways. So again, I apologize for giving you such a complicated answer, but this is, I think, Rav Yaakov's insight is a very valuable insight, that the theoretical LAMDUS of the yeshiva movement was min hashamayim, a response to the intellectualism of Haskalah, and an attempt to keep the brilliant minds in the Torah world. In fact, you have to understand, if you were a brilliant kid, they were looking, just like today, when you have these high school basketball, right, so you have these scouts all over the place. Well, they had scouts. If you were a brilliant kid, and typically you were poor, and often you didn't have parents, you had people trying to kidnap you on both sides. You had like spies, the Alter Slobodka would send out Rav Reuven Grozovsky to chap, these brilliant kids. And then you had maskilim, who would identify smart, poor kids and say, come to me, I'll take care of you, I'll give you good food and a good home, and I have a beautiful library of German books, and I'll get a tutor for you for German and Russian. I mean, literally, it's as if people were like bargaining, who gets the kid. Rav Aaron Kotler, as a boy, as an orphan, was on the verge of becoming a mathematics student until at the last minute, Rav Reuven Grozovsky kidnapped him to Slobodka. Rav Aaron had a sister who actually survived him quite a few years. She just died, I think, maybe a decade ago. And she was not so religious. She herself was a professor of mathematics in Russia. And her dying day, somebody visited her, she was over 100 or something. I don't know exactly, but she said, what a mathematician he would have been. She was regretting that, the yeshiva world, got him, as it were. Einstein, there was a short time in Einstein's life. Wow, what that would have been. Where, Einstein was a very rebellious person. He was a very independent person. He grew up in an assimilated home, and he was a rebel. So as a rebel, when he was like 12 or so, he was exploring Orthodox Judaism. That he was frum for a short time before his bar mitzvah, because that was kind of how he was rebelling against his parents. And what happened was, unfortunately, I think this person would have to give a din b'cheshbon in Shemayim. His parents took in a Jewish boarder medical student whose name was Max Talmud, of all things. And Max Talmud was an atheist, and he talked Einstein out of following mitzvos. And Einstein was not an atheist per se, but he didn't believe in Torah min hashamayim. He believed in God as the architect of the universe. So people like to fantasize a lot. Like, what would Einstein have been had Einstein, stayed in learning? In fact, they used to always ask, this was in Slobodka, a common discussion, who was smarter, Einstein or Rav Chaim Soloveitchik? That was like one of the things Bachrim used to talk about all the time in terms of depth of analysis. Who knows? Who knows? Yeah.
Here's a send-in. How is the Satan different from the HARA? Why are we able to confuse it with the shofar blasts every year? Does the Satan have no memory?
Yeah. So, so there are two questions here. Number one, what's the difference between the Satan and the HARA? And number two, this concept that we blow the shofar early on Rosh Hashanah before Musaf to confuse the Satan. So, doesn't he remember this stuff from last year? Like, what's going on? What happens to his memory? So, first of all, the Gemara itself says Satan and Yetzer Hara is the same thing, but it just refers to different functions. You know the old story about you get a ticket in a southern town, so the policeman who gives you the ticket, becomes the judge and the jury, and then he's the jailer, he does all the jobs. So the Satan has many, many jobs. As the Yetzer Hara within you, it causes you to sin. After you sin, the Satan is the prosecuting attorney in Shemayim. That's what Satan means, the prosecutor who talks to God, argues with God that you have to be punished, right? And he is then the executioner, because the Satan is also the Malach HaMaves. So the Yetzer Hara, Satan, Malach HaMaves is actually the same entity, whatever that means. As Yetzer Hara, he causes you to sin. As Satan, he accuses you in Shemayim. As Malach HaMaves, he carries out the sentence. Now, in terms of memory, again, just to be sure everyone knows the Gemara that we're talking about, on Rosh Hashanah, we blow the shofar twice, or two major units. We blow before the Musaf, and those are called the sitting down tekiyos, because although we stand up, but halachically you're allowed to sit down. And then we have the standing tekiyos that are blown during Musaf. Ashkenazim only blow them in the repetition. Sfardim and Hasidim and some others blow them even in the silent. And those are called mu'umad, the standing ones, because they're connected to an amida, to a shmona esrei. And the Gemara asks, why do you blow early? At least that's how most Rishonim learn. Just have the blowing of Musaf. Why do you blow early? So it says, we want to confuse the Satan. And the simple meaning is, because blowing the shofar is a sign that we're ready to be judged. And the Satan gets very worried when we show we're ready to be judged. If we're not scared of being judged, that means we have something up our sleeve, some mitzvah or whatever it is, so the Satan gets confused. Now the question is, we do this every year. We've been doing it for 2,000 years, this double blowing. So why doesn't the Satan remember? Again, it's a very excellent question. And there are different answers Meforshim give. One of the answers that Meforshim give is that Yetzer Haras are new Yetzer Haras every day. Meaning, think about this. Once you identify Satan and Yetzer Hara, the Yetzer Hara of one generation or even 1 year is not the same as the Yetzer Hara of the other year. In fact, the discussion I had 2 minutes ago illustrates that. In the 19th century, the Yetzer Hara was intellectualism. In the 20th and 21st century, the Yetzer Hara might be taiva. So yeah, there's no memory because it's a different type of koach that is responding to the unique challenges that every generation has. Yeah.
Here's another send-in. Why is it not considered TZNIUS to drink from a bottle and therefore needing a cup? There's a clarification that we're not referring to a 2-liter bottle, but like a standard Coke bottle.
I wouldn't declare this as a halacha. In other words, the person is assuming that you're not allowed, it's improper to drink from a bottle, meaning a small bottle, not a big bottle, which I think everybody would say looks a little gluttonous. I would not put that in the realm of halacha, but I do think that there is a sense, if you have a refined sensibility, that it's not the most dignified thing to do. That it looks like a person is a little gluttonous, that he doesn't, pour. Just like, for example, even if you're drinking from a cup, you don't chug it all down. Now, I will tell you one interesting thing. I saw there's very, very few, for whatever reason, there's very little video footage of Rav Moshe Feinstein. I'm not sure why, because when he died in the 1980s there. But whatever it is, you could almost see nothing of him on video. But I saw a short 3-minute thing, and he was giving a shiur, and I was very surprised. He took a glass of water, and he gulped the whole thing in one big gulp, and it looked funny. It looked a little gluttonous and the like, but the answer was very, very pashut. It was very, very pashut. In order to make a barei nefashos, so it says you have to drink a whole revius in the amount of time. It's a very unusual shiur. You have to drink a revius, that's 4 ounces, in the amount of time that it would take to drink a revius without interruption. So with bread, you have like up to 9 minutes or whatever, but some say that Kadesh Yasias revius is, you got to do the whole 4 ounces, like in one big gulp. So he wanted to make the bracha achrona, so he gulped the whole cup down, and then after that, he just drank little sips as a matter of refinement. Okay, that's just a digression. But in terms of it not being refined, it's a little hard to articulate, but I think, I mean, sometimes, you see, I don't know, maybe it's a matter of sensibility, it's hard to gauge it, but you see an important person, a president or somebody, and they take a water bottle and they just drink the water bottle. There is kind of a feeling it's not the most dignified type of behavior. And in these types of things, there's a certain subtlety. It's sometimes hard to put your finger on it, but I would absolutely not say that that's osur, that's forbidden. Now, and you see that Chazal had a very, very refined sensibility, that things bothered them that don't bother us so much. Let's consider the idea of eating in the street. So the Gemara says, if you're eating in the street, you're pasul li'edus because you're so unrefined, you're like an animal, and you might lie, and you might make up stories, because any person who can eat in the street is like, you're not a normal human being. You're a barbarian. Now, we don't necessarily look at things that way. We don't necessarily think if somebody is eating an ice cream. But Chazal are telling us we should look at it that way, that there is a certain sensibility in looking at things. And some people take it much more machmer. There are some people who will not eat at a smorgasbord, where they're not sitting down. They will not eat when they're standing up, because they consider that to kind of be eating publicly without having a designated table or place. And some people will not eat even in a designated table or place. Maybe a sudas mitzvah they'll eat, but other than that, they will not go to a restaurant, because they'll consider even a restaurant as ochel bashuk. That's a very, very big chumrah. So in matters of refinement, it's sometimes hard to define, but I think most of us would feel that somehow the bottle, it doesn't have the same dignity as a cup. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Okay.
So Tosos and Brachos. So the Mishnah, there's a Mishnah on Mem Amud base, I think, or maybe Mem Aleph Amud base, that says that, or there's like a brisa that says 100 women who bench are like 2 men. So Tosos there says the reason is because women don't know Hebrew. So that's why they are usually not Yotzei Birkat Hamazon if they all, or they're not Yotzei ZIMUN if they all bench together. So my question basically is that only if they don't, like, if they would know Hebrew, then this Tosos doesn't have an answer anymore, right? And also, nowadays, is this still the halacha, or I also wanted to know, are you allowed to say Birkat Hamazon in any language you want, or does it have to be Hebrew? It seems like he's implying that.
Yeah. So a few things. Number one, it's very, very clear that you are Yotzei Birkat Hamazon in any language. That's absolutely the case. Just like Kriya Shema, Shmona Esrei is B'chal Lashain, Birkat Hamazon, even though it's Doraisa, you're Yotzei B'chal Lashain. But Tosfos's argument that the reason even 100 women don't have the status of Zimun, of 3 men, is because they don't know Hebrew. So you're raising the question, so what if they know Hebrew? Does that change the halacha? Are we going to create Zimun as a chiyuv? It's very clear that the halacha is not going to be changed because the Chachamim made it based on certain assumptions, but that becomes the halacha, and that is not going to change. Now, you do know, of course, that even though 100 women are not chayavos in Zimun, 3 women are allowed to do Zimun. Nashim cannot combine with men. You can't have 2 women and a man or 2 men and a woman. But if you have a group of 3 women, they are allowed to do Zimun. And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach paskin a very interesting psak that let's say you have 3 women and 2 men. So the 2 men can't do Zimun. The 3 women can do Zimun in the presence of the 2 men, and the 2 men are supposed to answer. Right? In fact, a certain rabbi in the yeshiva of Flatbush, which is kind of a modern Orthodox thing, once said this halacha that if women, he wants to encourage women to do zimun, that if 3 women and 2 men are doing zimun, are eating together, the 2 men should not leave, but they should answer to the zimun of the 3 women. So one of his students was a girl who was a bit more frum than the other girls, or the other students. So she said, that can't be. You're using your women's liberationist stuff again. You know, she said, you're always pushing this and that. So the class was taking a trip to Eretz Yisrael, and they were going to visit Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So the teacher said, why don't you ask Rav Auerbach, when you're in his house, what the halacha is? So they asked Rav Shlomo Zalman, if you have 3 women and 2 men, should the 2 men stay and answer to the 3 women if the women want to do an optional zimun? So Rav Auerbach said the men should stay and the men should answer. So the girl piped up, says, that can't be right. She said it to her teacher in New York, and she said to Rav Shlomo Zalman, because it was so instinctual that wasn't the case. And yet, indeed, that was the case. The interesting question is why we don't encourage it. That's an interesting question. You know, women are patur from many mitzvahs. They're patur from shofar. They're patur from sukkah. They're patur from lulav. And yet, we encourage them to do it. And Ashkenazim even make a bracha. Sephardim don't make a bracha, except Moroccan Sephardim. But we encourage it. Generally speaking, we encourage women to do those mitzvos that they are exempt from. But there are some exceptions where we bedafka do not encourage. Tefillin is the outstanding exception in which the Ramah actually says women should not put on tefillin. Okay, that's a bit unique. But zimun is kind of a funny thing in the middle. We don't actively discourage it. In other words, no teacher is going to tell a girl, you're not allowed to be mezameh. But I think it's also the case that we don't actively encourage it. So the way we tell a woman to take a lulav is with a lot more enthusiasm than the way we tell a woman she's allowed to be mezameh. So sociologically, there may be some interesting svaras. Which mitzvos are pushed as desirable for women, and which mitzvahs do we decide not to push, even though theoretically they would be permitted? Now, tefillin, as I say, is in a category by itself, either because it's called a beged ish, the garment of a man, or because tefillin has a very important connection to the cleanliness of the body, and women are niddos, etc. So again, tefillin is a separate discussion. But zimun, there's no problem at all for nashim to be mezamnos if they want to. They don't mention HASHEM if they have a minyan, but they could be mezamin as a group of 3 up to whatever number. And yet, it's very clear that the Beis Yaakovs do not actively encourage women being mezamnos. Yeah.
What exactly changed after Adam ate from TZNIUS? And I guess my question also is what was the purpose of a world where there wasn't necessarily struggle or difficulty? Because we always talk about how so much of the things that we do have value because we work hard for it and we struggle with it. But seemingly, before there wasn't so much really the HARA to be good and bad. So, I guess what was God's intention in making a world where everything was just provided for and everything was easy to come by?
It's a very difficult question because the whole world, the world of struggle, the world of sin, is Plan B. This was not Hashem's original plan, although Hashem knew what would happen. Hashem's original plan was that man was put in the Garden of Eden. He had one commandment, not to eat from that fruit. That commandment, by the way, would have lasted one day, meaning had Adam waited till Shabbos, that would have been permitted too. That would have been the end of it. So as you know, the Derech Hashem says that the ultimate goal here is that God wanted to create a world where he would bestow his goodness upon us. But if he would bestow his goodness without our struggle and without our working for it, it would have been the bread of humiliation, the bread of shame. So God had to create a struggle. But the original plan is that struggle was very limited and of short duration. It would have been, don't eat from this fruit. That would have been the struggle. And that would have taken away the nahama de kisufa, the bread of embarrassment, And that would have let us have the eternal relationship with God, which is Olam Haba. Essentially, Olam Haba would have been everything eternity. Now, there is, of course, a very, very famous question, which is really hard to answer. And that is, we say, until Adam ate from the Eitz HADAAS, he didn't have a Yetzer Hara. So if he didn't have a Yetzer Hara, how could the Nachash entice him to eat? There's no Yetzer Hara. Now, one answer that's given is, well, there was a Yetzer Hara, but the Yetzer Hara was outside of him and not within him, and the Nachash was the Yetzer Hara. But I don't know. What type of answer is that? If there's no Yetzer Hara inside of me, then what is that external force? How does that have any power over me? There's nothing to which I would respond, you see? So that's a famous circular problem of if there's no Yetzer Hara till after he eats, then what was the Yetzer Hara that made him eat? And if the Yetzer Hara was outside of him, how could the Yetzer Hara outside of me have any influence on me unless there's something inside of me that creates a receptivity? So that's a good question. But nevertheless, it's very, very clear that that was defined as a struggle. And because it was defined as a struggle, that was Nahama de Kisufa. That would be enough to take off the Nahama de Kisufa, and therefore the tachlis of the Bria was that Hashem would be mative to us. That's the goal. That's why he made it. Once we brought the Yetzer Hara into ourselves, however, we created defect. We created an inability to be connected to God till we purify ourselves. So at this point, our avodah has a second need. In other words, the statement of the Derech Hashem that the only purpose of mitzvahs is to take away the shame of getting God's tov is only 100% true before we ate from the Eitz HADAAS. Once we ate from the Eitz HADAAS, there's a secondary reason why we have to do mitzvahs, and that is to purify our neshamas, to make it worthy and able of receiving that light. I do have to stop. Just, last question.
Sure.
Yeah.
This is Sundin. Can the rabbi shed some light regarding the tucking of the knots of one's tzitzis? Is it halacha, masora, minhag, and why do some rabbis tuck and others don't tuck?
Tie the tzitzis, mean?
Tuck the knots of the tzitzis, like the knots, like just the strings hang out, but not the knots on something.
Which knots are you referring to?
I think it's like the bigger knot, like these, like these.
Oh, okay, yeah. So very, very clear. The halacha says absolutely that when the strings are run through the hole in the talus, whether it's a talus gadol or a talus katan, they must be attached through a double knot. So the top knot that ties your strings to the talus is vadai a chiyuv, and it seems to be a chiyuv d'oraisa. That's called kesher elyain, which is d'oraisa. Now, insofar as the Torah is concerned, as long as you have that single double knot, you don't need anything else. Everything else can come down. Nevertheless, Kabbalistically, there's a lot of significance in the different numbers, what they add up to, and the like, and that's why there'll be different minhagim, because beyond the kesher elyon, there is no chiyuv to have other knots. The other knots are not even midrabanan. Technically, they have a status of minhagim that are very, very holy and sacred.
But the question then becomes, do we tuck these or not, like to hide them and just let the strings hang out?
Oh, okay. You're talking about a different thing. You're talking about how much do you show?
Sure.
Yeah, how much do you show? Meaning, if you follow the halacha, which not everybody follows, so Ravaja, many Sfardim don't follow, that your tzitzis should be showing because of ureisem oso, right? Is it only the strings, or is it also the knots? Yeah, so that's different minhagim. Al pi Kabbalah, it's only the strings, but many say the whole tzitzis should be there as well. So that already is totally on inyanim of Kabbalah. Okay. All right. Take care, everybody.